I turned my old coffee maker into an ecosystem. I got the idea from one of my other setups in my living room that has dark brown water like coffee. You may be asking yourself, how is this even possible? Well, quite frankly, I have no clue, but I'm already committed to the idea, so there's no turning back at this point. After thorough analysis, I realized that there's three main things I'm gonna need to figure out to make this work. One is how I'm gonna modify this coffee pot. The next thing is, what the heck can even live in here? And most importantly, I need to make it look like coffee. So we're gonna be tackling the first part of this list, which is making sure our ecosystem works like a real coffee pot. So the first thing I need to figure out is how to get the water from the pot back into the coffee maker and have it drip back down into the pot like a waterfall. I also need to figure out what's going on with these buttons and where I'm gonna be putting the light. So let's pop this bad boy open and see what's going on with these buttons here. After clipping the wires and unscrewing everything, I realized that it would just be easier to add my own buttons. So I'm gonna start by adding one button. This is gonna be for the light, and I'm gonna drill a separate hole for it so I don't disturb any of the decoy buttons in the front. I'd like to keep it as original as possible, so I only wired in this one button to start with. So the next thing I need to figure out is how the water is gonna get back into the pot. My first thought was to drill the glass, but I just don't think that's possible. The easiest way to make this happen is just with this little submersible pump and a hose that goes to the top. This is also gonna allow me to run the wires for the light and the accessories. So let's add the light. I'm using this cheap waterproof peel and stick light that I bought on Amazon. I have my reservations whether this is gonna work long term, but it's by far my easiest option, so we'll use it for now. And hopefully it doesn't burn my house down in the process. So I'm gonna drill a hole and run the hose up to the top from the pump. It's gonna take a little more room up in the coffee pot, but in the end, it's gonna give me more flexibility, and it's also gonna require the least amount of modifications. And we have water. Would you just look at that?
Just look at that.
I'm gonna leave the hose up top here for now so we could start getting into the juicy meat and potatoes of the setup. So setting the container up is gonna be the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what's actually gonna be able to live in here. Just to give you an idea of what I've gotten myself into, the recommended tank size for a single bed of fish is 5 gallons. For a small school of guppies, it's around 10 gallons. And for a few goldfish, it can be as much as 40 to 55 gallons. This setup is under a gallon. And that's not even mentioning the fact that whatever's gonna be living in here needs to be able to tolerate acidic brown water. Luckily, I think I have just the solution that's also gonna help me dodge those animal abuse charges. But before I reveal what my ride or die companions are, let me explain what I'm doing in the container. I'm setting up a basic underwater environment with some rocks, driftwood, some substrate which consists of sand and aquatic soil, some pebbles, and also some very hardy plants. So I want to keep it simple, but I also want it to look nice and natural. I'll put a list of what I used in the description in case there's any fish weebs out there like me that actually care about that stuff. Here's the first iteration of our coffee maker ecosystem. I wanted to test out the concept first before I start stepping into uncharted territory. So let's get back to the question of what animals are actually going in this setup. As I alluded to before, fish are out of the question because they're weak. I need an animal that's
built different,
that could survive the hot, crammed recesses of a coffee pot. That's why I'm going to the slimy, boneless, and straight-up disrespected cousins of fish at the pet store, which are invertebrates. I have a few different ones I'd like to add, but we're gonna start with the OG dwarf shrimp. They are extremely tiny, can tolerate a wide range of conditions, produce next to no waste, and come in a variety of different colors. They also scavenge on any decaying matter and help keep the tank clean. They're basically nature's version of the sanitation department. True bottom feeders that run off other people's waste. These are perfect. I'm also gonna add a little waste of my own so they feel a little more at home in here. Just kidding, but it sure does smell like it. This is actually a live bacteria culture and it's gonna help balance out the system. Without it, I wouldn't be able to add any organisms for about 6 weeks. I'm going to be testing everything out with these 3 shrimp for now before adding any other organisms just to make sure nothing catastrophic happens. I'll even give them names at the end of the video as a reward for putting up with my shenanigans. In the meantime, let's start working on some other parts of this setup. I originally wanted to use the back water tank as an extension of the setup just to get some extra water volume, but I ended up not doing that. So then I thought to myself, how can I make this setup even more interesting? I'm going to turn it into a planter and put some plants in there. For one, it's going to make it look way cooler, but it's also going to serve a purpose, which I'll show you all once it's done. But before that, I need to get my daily intake of tomato in. I'm Italian, so this is very important. I ran to Home Depot and picked up a few houseplants that would fit the theme of the setup and give it a little extra flair. Also, while I had the back all apart, I took the opportunity to improve on my design a little bit by utilizing the little plastic spouty thingy and turning it into a waterfall. All I had to do was retrofit it and run the pump from the hose up to it. And just like that, we got a nice jungly planted top to go along with our fish tank. I'm pretty happy with how everything came out design-wise so far, so let's get into the main reason why you're watching this video. As you guys may have already noticed, the water is not brown yet, and unfortunately, there's not going to be any coffee in this setup. But thankfully, I have the next best thing, some pine cones. So let me explain. We're going to be utilizing something called tannins. Tannins are organic compounds found in almost all plant matter, including leaves and tea bags. If you've ever seen a body of water that looks like it has a brown tint to it, this is why. Not only does it look cool, but it actually brings the pH down and creates an antibacterial property that's good for the ecosystem. To achieve this, all I have to do is add some leaves and pine cones to the coffee filter. And as the water flows over all those leaves, it's going to slowly turn our water nice and brown. I'll also add some in the setup itself to help speed it up. I'm going to let the setup sit and brew for a couple weeks to make sure everything is okay before I continue on with anything. Just as expected, some things came up that I had to address. The first thing I immediately noticed is that the lights kept flickering and burning out for some reason, but then I realized it was my own stupidity that caused it. Well, I figured out why the lights kept burning out. It's because this is a 24-volt driver, and these lights were 12-volt, so... I also realized one of the plants in this setup, called Hornwort, was not
built different
and kept shedding its leaves, so I had to remove it. And the final and most important thing I had to address was the flow from the pump up through the waterfall kept slowing down. At first glance, this may not seem like a big issue, but because the water wasn't circulating properly, it caused the tank temperature to start increasing. And also on a smaller note, I noticed some of the moss I planted up top is not doing too well. I'm going to fix these few things, finish the modifications, and also add the rest of the livestock. Fixing the light was pretty simple. All I did was swap out the driver and install the new lights into the top. These are 100% waterproof, so they'll hold up much better. Next was addressing the hornwort. Generally, when there's a change in water parameters, it takes a little while for plants to adapt to the new environment. So when I made the water more acidic, its tiny little pathetic needles couldn't keep up. In its place, I added another hardy plant called water Sprite. This plant is an
absolute beast
and will definitely be able to survive in this environment. The next thing was addressing the water flow. This one was a little more difficult because of the limited space I was dealing with. I originally used a small hose assuming it would be enough, but I didn't account for any obstructions that could cut off the flow. To fix this, I replaced it with a larger, flexible silicone tubing, which drastically increased the water flow. And finally, I addressed the moss on top. It wasn't doing too well and started to get really dried out, so I replaced it and added some plants that'll do a lot better. Now that the major issues were addressed, I wanted to add a few final modifications. The first thing I did was rewire the original button I installed to now control the pump. And I also added 2 more buttons, one for the light and one for a super secret accessory that's going to put this setup over the top. Oh, and I don't know if you noticed, but when I threw away that circuit board with the original buttons, it also housed the clock that was on the original coffee maker. So now I have a nice little window of nothing in the front here. I'll show you what I'm doing with that later. Now that all the issues were fixed and our setup is finally complete, it's time to add the rest of the livestock. I bought 3 more shrimp to go along with the 3 original shrimp. So 2 blue, 2 yellow, and 2 red. I also wanted to add another species. So I added a few Malaysian trumpet snails. Like the shrimp, they don't get too big and they're also going to help keep everything clean and in order. Now that everything is fixed and we added the rest of the animals, let's let it sit a little longer and see the results. I think I can officially say that this project's finally complete. The inside of the tank is finally starting to look and feel more like an ecosystem. The plants have grown in and established themselves, and all the organisms are really enjoying the environment.
Hey, move it, pal.
Also, as promised, I named our shrimpy companions. This is Duncan. And we have Beans.
Hello.
7-Eleven. Tim Horton. And lastly, we have subscribe and notification bell, which you should totally do if you made it this far in the video. Now let's take a little deeper dive into how everything else is doing. The tank is now way more active than it was before. Some baby snails have made their appearance, and I've also noticed some new micro-aquatic organisms flailing around the tank. They may look pretty ugly and concerning at first, but they're actually a sign that everything is doing really well. Oh, and that window in the front? I made it into a picture frame to remind our shrimp friends what they could have become if I messed this project up. While we're at it, let me explain the buttons. The red one controls the pump, the green one controls the lights, and the blue one for the super secret accessory is a fog maker I added. After all, what's a nice hot cup of coffee without a little steam coming off the top? All of the new plants on top are doing great. They've started to establish themselves, and we're even getting some new growth on some of them. I even found a little millipede that seemed to have hitched a ride in somehow. I'm guessing he was in some of the dirt I scooped up from the tomato garden. He must be Italian. I really like the look of this moss that I collected from my yard. The waterfall has also been holding up much better now that the flow's increased. I haven't had to adjust it once. It also makes maintenance a breeze because all I have to do is twist it around to the back, water the plants, and add some fresh water. Between the easy water changes and the snails and shrimp that help keep the tank clean, I'm not kidding when I say this might be the lowest maintenance setup I've ever made. Overall, I'm really happy with how everything came out. Now that all my hard work is done, it's time to have a nice cup of coffee.